Good afternoon. It's my privilege today to greet you from our sister facility in Greenfield. I'm in the chapel there recording our fourth session of the week of the Law of Intuition with Jethro as our biblical character that we are studying this week. And as I've said, we are talking about the leadership law of intuition. Intuitive leaders, as we've reminded you each day this week, can sense what's happening among people and almost instantly know their hopes, fears, and concerns. In other words, intuitive leaders just know that they know that they know. Without studying, without researching, they just have that deep inner sense of knowing what to do. And as it says here, knowing the hopes, fears, and concerns of the people that they lead. Today, we want to focus on this leadership thought, and it's an encouraging one for you, I hope, that your leadership intuition can be increased. Before we jump into the meat of the lesson today, I'd like to give you all a word of encouragement, and that is this, that discussions about leadership intuition will tend to impact people in one of two ways. Those of you who would consider yourselves natural leaders are probably encouraged by this week's lessons because perhaps you see yourself in the story of Jethro and you can identify with his character. But for those of you that would say, I'm not sure that I naturally excel at leadership, you may identify more with Moses and perhaps even experience some level of discouragement. But here's the good news for you who are part of that second group. But first, let me share a word with those of you who are naturally blessed with intuition, and that's this. Keep refining and maximizing your gift with the goal of adding value to others. But if you think you identify more with the second group, be encouraged today because Moses wasn't a natural leader either. Yet at the end of the day, he became one of the greatest leaders in all the Bible. And so we want to just take a moment here and talk about the advantage of intuition. Suppose I were to challenge a world record holder sprinter in a 100-yard dash. I'm actually quite sure that I would win, even though no one would ever accuse me of being fast. Now, how in the world could I pull that off, or could you pull that off? Well, actually, it's simple. I get a 75-yard head start. You see, that's what happens when a leader who possesses intuition. It's like getting a big head start in a race. So as we look into the story, Jethro used his God-given intuition to give Moses a head start in the race of leadership development. Jethro's intuition empowered Moses to improve his leadership skills in 5 different ways. And we want to take a look at those right now. Moses grew as a leader, first because he became a man of prayer. Secondly, because he communicated personally with the people. Third, he laid out a vision. Fourth, he selected and trained leaders. And then fifth, he released those leaders to lead. So let's take a deeper dive into these 5 aspects of Moses' growth. Before Jethro encouraged Moses to stand before the people to share the changes that needed to be made, he advised Moses first to stand before God, interceding for the people. Eventually, Moses became a great person of prayer, one of the greatest in the Bible. Now, isn't it interesting that we just got done describing Moses as one who became one of the greatest leaders in the Bible, and here we're saying that Moses became a great person of prayer, one of the greatest prayer warriors, if you will, in the Bible. Makes me wonder, I wonder if there is a connection between the fact that Moses was a great person of prayer and that he became one of the greatest leaders in the Bible. That's just a thought thrown in at no extra charge. But it is important to notice that Jethro encouraged Moses first to stand before God, and then, and only then, to stand before the people. Moving along to the second point, he communicated personally with the people. Now, this was actually an area for Moses where he had quite a bit of growth to do. Because if you remember, according to earlier in Exodus, Moses, when he was called by God, this was the account of the burning bush, Moses was so reluctant to fulfill God's call. And one of the main reasons why is that he told God that he couldn't speak very well and that he had a stutter. And so he was so reluctant to speak to the people on God's behalf that God had to actually recruit Moses' brother Aaron to do the talking for him. So God would speak to Moses, Moses would then speak to Aaron, and Aaron finally would speak to the people. Now, really, that's not a way to maximize your leadership ability if you can't communicate personally and directly with your people. But fortunately for Moses, he did learn to start speaking directly to the people. And when he did, guess what happened? The bond between him and them grew exponentially, and his leadership potential reached a new level. So Jethro encouraged Moses first to stand before God and then to stand with the people. Now, the next way in which Moses grew as a leader because of Jethro's encouragement is that Moses laid out a vision for the people. Jethro instructed him, or as Jethro instructed him, Moses laid out a vision for a whole new way of life for the children of Israel as he taught them about the ways of God and how they should live. Because Israel had been in bondage to the Egyptians for over 400 years. And so they did not really have an experience of God's governance. Instead, they only knew slavery to the Egyptians. And so this was a very new experience for them. They were going to have to learn to trust in God and to put their faith in him and to live out a whole different way of living, in that God's laws were certainly not the ways of the Egyptians. And so Moses laid out a vision in the sense that he taught the people how Israel should live, what God wanted and expected of them, and just the very ways of God. Fourth, Moses selected and trained leaders. Now, we've said before throughout the week, but I want to reiterate it right now, that this actually was the key to Jethro's plan, as it both enabled Moses to concentrate on the most difficult cases and ensure that the people would get their cases adjudicated in a timely fashion. Note that Moses did not ask for volunteers. The scripture indicates that Moses selected able men from all of Israel to raise up into these positions. Now, keep in mind that according to Exodus chapter 12 and verse 37, there were over 600,000 men included in the group that left Egypt. So to think about Moses raising up leaders with that many people to select from, what an incredibly challenging task. And with that, he had to assign each one according to his ability, whether they were to lead thousands, hundreds, fifties, or tens. And finally, in this journey, he released them to lead. You see, it's one thing to create a position and to fill it, But it takes a real leader to actually release the authority necessary for these new leaders to carry out their new responsibilities. Some leaders will appoint people and maybe give them a title, but it takes an extra level of security in order to also give the authority that this new leader needs in order to carry out their responsibilities. So Moses resisted any inclination that he may have had to micromanage these new leaders. He actually turned the more routine cases over to these leaders to decide. And he only kept the most difficult ones that these new leaders couldn't resolve. So in other words, he only kept direct control over those matters that he alone could resolve. He entrusted all the rest to the new leaders he raised up. That is really good leadership, to give all the authority that you can to people that you lead, and that you as a leader handle only those issues that only you can resolve. And so as we begin to wind down our time today, learning to become a better leader, a more intuitive leader, is a process. It takes time and probably lots of trials, but anyone can do it. By the end of Moses' life, he knew intuitively that the people needed another leader to guide them after he died. And when he asked God to provide one, he gave the people Joshua, a man who had been learning leadership from Moses for more than 40 years. And Moses was prescient in another way, in that he understood that the children of Israel would need to be led by a person who was skilled in battle, which Moses was not. But Joshua was a trained warrior, because they were going to go into the promised land, but it wasn't going to be handed to them. They were going to have to fight for it. And so Joshua was uniquely prepared, both in terms of his background, but especially with all of those years being mentored by Moses and prepared by him to assume that position. Think of a legendary leader such as Moses and how difficult that it would be to follow someone like that. And yet Joshua was the one who led them across the Jordan River and led them in terms of conquering the promised land. So it brings us once again to our question for reflection. And that's simply this: what are you doing to increase your leadership intuition? As always, we really appreciate you being with us each and every day. We look forward to having this time together. Remember that tomorrow, being Friday, we will gather at 1:30, not 3:30, for our wrap-up session to this week. And of course, we'll introduce our section next week, but that will wait till tomorrow. You'll have to wait until tomorrow to get the information on what waits us next week. So until tomorrow at 1:30, we ask God's blessing on you, and thank you for being with us today. God bless you all.